You spread it on your toast every morning. You've been eating it since you were a kid. It's in your pantry right now. That dark brown jar with the yellow lid, sitting there like it's always belonged. Vegemite, Australia's favorite spread, the taste of home. But what if I told you that the thing we've trusted for generations might not be exactly what we think it is? And I'm not talking about the taste. I'm talking about what's actually inside that jar. Here's the thing. I'm not a scientist. I'm not a nutritionist. I'm just someone who grew up eating Vegemite on toast, just like you probably did. And a few weeks ago, I was standing in the supermarket aisle, holding that familiar jar, when something made me pause. You know that moment when you suddenly see something you've looked at 1,000 times before, but this time, you actually see it? That's what happened. I turned the jar around and started reading the label properly. Not just glancing at it, actually reading it. And that's when things got interesting. We all know the story, don't we? Vegemite is Australian. It's been around since 1923. It's made from brewer's yeast extract. It's packed with B vitamins. We've heard this so many times it's almost like background noise. But when you start looking at what's actually in there, beyond the marketing and the nostalgia and the cultural identity we've wrapped around this product, you start to notice details that don't quite fit the picture we've been sold. Small things at first. Things that make you wonder why they're there at all. So I did what any curious Australian would do. I started comparing, not just reading one label, but actually looking at what we're eating, what we're feeding our kids, and asking the most basic question anyone should ask about their food. What is this, really? And the answers I found weren't exactly reassuring. Let's start with what Vegemite is supposed to be. The official story is simple enough. It's a yeast extract spread made from leftover brewer's yeast, the stuff that's left over after making beer. That yeast gets processed, concentrated, and turned into the thick, dark spread we know. Along the way, they add salt, some vegetable extract, and a few other ingredients. The result is supposed to be this nutritional powerhouse, loaded with B vitamins, particularly thiamine, riboflavin, niacin, and folate. On paper, it sounds reasonable. One of those foods that might not taste great to everyone, but at least it's doing something good for you. That's the story we've been told anyway. But here's where it gets complicated. When you actually look at the ingredients list, you're not just seeing yeast extract and vitamins. You're seeing things that make you stop and think. Salt, for instance. We all know Vegemite is salty. That's part of its character, right? Except the amount of salt in there is staggering. We're talking about something that's roughly 3% salt by weight. That might not sound like much until you remember that most people don't just scrape a tiny bit onto their toast. And even if you do, even if you're one of those people who uses it sparingly, you're still getting a concentrated hit of sodium that adds up faster than you'd think. Now, before you say it, yes, I know, you're supposed to use it in small amounts. That's what everyone says. But let's be honest about how Australians actually eat Vegemite. Kids, especially. How many parents have watched their child enthusiastically spread it on thick because they love the taste? How many of us, even as adults, go a bit heavier than we probably should? The recommended serving size is 5 grams. That's about a teaspoon. And in that teaspoon, you're looking at around 165 milligrams of sodium. That's roughly 7% of your recommended daily intake in one serving. And that's if you only have it once. If you have Vegemite on toast for breakfast, maybe a Vegemite sandwich for lunch, those numbers start climbing. Suddenly, you're looking at a significant chunk of your daily sodium coming from just one product. But it's not just about the salt. There's something else in that ingredient list that catches your eye when you're looking closely. Flavor enhancers. Specifically, you'll often see things like disodium inosinate and disodium guanylate. These are compounds that amplify the savory, umami taste that makes Vegemite so distinctive. Now, these aren't necessarily harmful in the amounts we're talking about. They're approved food additives, used in plenty of products. But here's the question nobody really asks. Why are they there at all? If Vegemite is made from yeast extract, which already has a strong, distinctive flavor, why does it need flavor enhancers? What are they enhancing, exactly? And more importantly, what would it taste like without them? This is where things start to feel less straightforward than the marketing suggests. When you dig into how yeast extract is actually made, you find out it's not quite as simple as just collecting leftover yeast and putting it in a jar. The process involves breaking down yeast cells, concentrating them, and processing them in ways that fundamentally alter what you're left with. It's industrial, it's complex, and the end result is something that, while technically derived from a natural source, has been so heavily processed that calling it natural feels like a stretch. It's a bit like saying corn syrup is natural because it comes from corn. Technically true, but it's hiding the whole story. And then there's the vitamin fortification. This is usually presented as one of Vegemite's big selling points. All those B vitamins added to give you a nutritional boost. Sounds good, right? Except when you look at the actual amounts, you start to wonder if it's as beneficial as it sounds. Sure, you're getting vitamins, but you're getting them in a form that's been added artificially to a heavily processed product. It's not the same as getting those vitamins from whole foods, where they occur naturally alongside other nutrients that help your body absorb and use them properly. It's a bit like taking a vitamin pill and calling it a meal. It might tick a box on a nutrition label, but it's not the same thing as actual nourishment. Here's something else that's interesting. When you compare Vegemite to similar products in other countries, you start noticing patterns. The UK has Marmite, which is similar, but not identical. Different flavor, slightly different ingredients. New Zealand has their own version. But when you look at the sodium content across these products, they're all in the same ballpark. High, really high. And they all use similar processing methods, similar additives. It's almost like there's a formula for making these yeast extract spreads, and that formula requires a lot of salt and chemical enhancement to make them palatable. Which raises an uncomfortable question. If these products need this much processing and this many additives to taste the way they do, what does that tell us about what we're actually eating? Now, let's talk about what happens when you eat this regularly. Not just occasionally, but as part of your daily routine. Like I did, like millions of Australians do. The sodium adds up, obviously. We know excess sodium is linked to high blood pressure, which increases your risk of heart disease and stroke. That's not controversial. That's just medical fact. But it's not just about blood pressure. High sodium intake can affect your kidneys, especially over time. It can contribute to fluid retention. It can interfere with calcium absorption, which matters if you're concerned about bone health. And while one serving of Vegemite won't cause these problems, the cumulative effect of regular consumption, combined with all the other sources of sodium in a typical Australian diet, starts to paint a different picture than the healthy breakfast spread we've been sold. Then there's the question of what this does to your palate. This is something nutritionists talk about, but most people don't think about. When you regularly consume very salty, very intensely flavored foods, you're essentially training your taste buds to expect that level of intensity. Foods that are naturally mild or subtly flavored start tasting bland by comparison. You need more salt, more flavor, more intensity to get the same satisfaction. It's a cycle that can make it harder to enjoy simpler, less processed foods. And for kids especially, if they grow up eating Vegemite regularly, they're developing a preference for high-sodium foods at an age when their taste preferences are being formed. But here's where the story takes an unexpected turn. Because when you look at the actual research on yeast extract itself, separate from all the salt and additives, you find that it's not inherently bad. Yeast extract does contain glutamates, the compounds responsible for that umami flavor. It does have some B vitamins naturally. In small amounts, as part of a varied diet, it's probably fine. The problem isn't really the yeast extract. The problem is everything else. The processing, the sodium, the flavor enhancers. The way it's marketed as this healthy, essential part of an Australian breakfast, when really it's just another highly processed food product that we've wrapped in nostalgia and national identity. And that's the uncomfortable truth, isn't it? Vegemite isn't bad for you because it's poisonous or toxic or dangerous in any dramatic way. It's bad for you in the same way that most heavily processed, high-sodium foods are bad for you. Not catastrophically, not immediately, but gradually, cumulatively, in ways that add up over years of daily consumption. It's the difference between something that will make you sick right away and something that contributes to chronic health issues down the line. The second category is harder to see, harder to measure, and much easier to dismiss. The Australian Heart Foundation recommends we consume less than 2,000 milligrams of sodium per day. The World Health Organization puts the ideal limit even lower, at 2,000 milligrams maximum, but preferably closer to 1,500. When you start adding up your daily sodium intake from all sources, bread, cheese, processed meats, sauces, snacks, and yes, Vegemite, you start to see how quickly you can exceed those recommendations without even realizing it. And the thing about Vegemite is that because we've been eating it forever, because it's part of our cultural identity, because it's Vegemite, we don't think of it as processed food in the same way we think of chips or instant noodles. But in terms of sodium content and processing, it's right up there. Now, I'm not saying you need to throw out your Vegemite jar and never touch it again. That's not what this is about. What I am saying is that maybe we need to rethink our relationship with it. Maybe instead of having it every day, we treat it as an occasional thing. Maybe we use genuinely tiny amounts instead of spreading it like we spread peanut butter. Maybe we stop thinking of it as a health food and start thinking of it as what it actually is, a highly processed, high-sodium spread that we happen to like the taste of. There's nothing wrong with enjoying it occasionally, but there's something wrong with pretending it's good for you when the evidence suggests otherwise. And here's what really gets me. Vegemite is marketed so heavily towards families, towards kids. You see it everywhere. Lunchboxes, breakfast tables, snacks after school. It's positioned as this wholesome Australian thing that good parents give their children. But when you actually look at what's in it and what health organizations recommend about sodium intake for children, it doesn't add up. Kids need even less sodium than adults. Their smaller bodies process it differently. And establishing a preference for high-salt foods in childhood can set up eating patterns that last a lifetime. So when we're giving our kids Vegemite regularly, thinking we're giving them something nutritious, something Australian, something good, what are we actually doing? We're potentially setting them up for a lifetime of craving intensely salty foods and exceeding recommended sodium limits. The thing is, there are alternatives. Not other yeast extract spreads, those have the same issues, but actual alternatives. Nut butters without added salt or sugar, avocado, hummus, even just butter or olive oil on good bread. Foods that don't require fortification to be nutritious because they're nutritious to begin with. Foods that don't need flavor enhancers because they have actual flavor. And yes, I know they don't taste like Vegemite. Nothing tastes like Vegemite. But maybe that's the point. Maybe we've been so focused on this one distinctive taste that we've forgotten there are other options that are actually better for us. Here's something interesting. When you talk to nutritionists and dietitians about Vegemite, off the record, they'll often tell you they wouldn't recommend it, not as a regular part of anyone's diet. The sodium content alone is enough to make them cautious. Add in the processing, the additives, the concerns about developing a preference for high-salt foods, and it becomes something they'd rather people avoided. But publicly, you rarely hear this, because Vegemite is Vegemite. It's Australian culture. Criticizing it feels almost unpatriotic, and that's exactly the problem. We've let a brand become so intertwined with national identity that we can't look at it objectively anymore. So, where does this leave us? Standing in your kitchen, looking at that jar, trying to decide what to do. The information is there. The sodium content is right on the label. The ingredients list tells you what you're eating. The health recommendations from organizations around the world are clear about sodium limits. None of this is hidden. It's all available if you choose to look. The question is whether we're willing to actually see it, or whether we'd rather keep believing the story we've always been told. Vegemite isn't going to kill you. Let's be clear about that. Having it occasionally, in small amounts, as part of an otherwise balanced diet, is probably fine. But treating it as a daily staple, especially for children, especially in the amounts many Australians actually consume it, that's a different story. That's where the cumulative effects start to matter. That's where the sodium adds up. That's where the preference for highly processed, intensely flavored foods gets established. And that's where the disconnect between what we think we're eating and what we're actually eating becomes a problem. This isn't about demonizing one product. It's about being honest about what our food actually is. Vegemite is a heavily processed, high-sodium spread with added flavor enhancers and fortified vitamins, marketed as a healthy part of Australian culture. It's not poison, but it's also not the wholesome, nutritious breakfast staple it's often portrayed as. It's somewhere in between. And maybe it's time we stopped pretending otherwise. You can still love the taste. You can still enjoy it. You can still buy it. But maybe you'll think twice before spreading it on thick every single morning. Maybe you'll read the label a bit more carefully. Maybe you'll consider whether this is really what you want to be feeding your family every day. Because ultimately, that's what this comes down to. Not fear, not judgment, just information. Just looking at what's actually in that jar and deciding for yourself whether that fits with how you want to eat. The next time you're in the supermarket, standing in front of that shelf full of jars, take a moment, pick one up, turn it around. Read what's actually there, not what you've always assumed was there. Look at the sodium content. Look at the ingredients. Think about how much you actually use, and how often. Think about what else you could put on your toast that might be better for you. You might still choose Vegemite, and that's fine. But at least it'll be a choice you're making with your eyes open, rather than just habit wrapped in nostalgia. Because at the end of the day, that's what really matters. Not whether Vegemite is good or bad in some absolute sense, but whether you know what you're actually eating, and whether you're okay with that. And now you know. What you do with that information is entirely up to you.